Professor Julie Bushkova, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I consider it a privilege to be hosting you. You are, for people who don't know, considered to be one of the world's greatest living violin pedagogues, not just in the United States, but recognized internationally for your musicianship and your teaching abilities. You have a YouTube channel that has done extraordinarily well, focusing on all things violin pedagogue in teaching. You teach students live. You walk them through the Russian school system of scales and etudes, going from just basic fundamentals to advanced techniques. So far, so good. Is that a fair introduction so far?
Very flowery.
Yes. So beyond that, I wanted to open this up, starting with your background, talking about your background, and just jumping right in. Would you mind? You started violin at a young age, I know, and you started violin in the Soviet Union, and I'm very interested in what that experience was like. So if you just want to
Mhm.
start there, and then we'll see what happens.
Okay. Yes, indeed. I started in Soviet Union. There was such a country back then. Um, I wanted to play violin for the reasons that many, but not all, children would like to do what their parents do. And both my parents were violinists. My mother had her whole life career and all as a soloist, violinist, soloist who performed with alone, and recitals and with orchestras as a soloist. She never professionally played in the orchestra. And my father, on the other hand, was a professional orchestral player and a kind of soloist in the orchestra because he was principal second of several symphonies. But yeah, so I grew up in this environment. So I actually didn't even know that other professions existed at all until much later. And meanwhile, I still read books and at the early age. And somehow, in books, of course, from books, I knew that there are professions, but they were sort of all blurry and not real. And the only reality were the musicians and especially violinists because they were nearby. So I wanted to play violin. I thought I did anyway by that time. And I asked them to give me a violin right away. I don't remember how old I was. But so they told me when you're five. And that's a famous, by now, legend story that when I woke up on my fifth birthday and there was no violin because my parents forgot, I asked them probably a year and a half before, and I just shut up about this. And I thought, okay, I'll wait until I'm five. So, but there was no violin because they thought it wasn't serious, and I was very upset. Anyway, but the point is, so I started eventually almost at six. I didn't start really, I mean, it was early, but not as early as many youngsters now start. At three, at four, I think it's way too early, actually. I mean, near six, between five and six is early enough. It really is a lot early. Um, so anyway, so that's how I started. But later, I realized that I had many more relatives, and as a matter of fact, around my nuclear family, or so to speak, right? If that's the correct term to say, my father and mother, and later my brother. So around them, and later my brother joined the ranks, and he started, and he's younger, and he started playing violin also because all of us played, and I played already. Um, but around our family, everybody else wasn't musicians or weren't. They were doctors. And as I grew up, I realized that I think I have much more of medical gene in me, actually. So it was interesting to discover later on in life that, my interests and my dispositions, to certain other professions possibly. But at that point, I started, and the way of development in Soviet Union was such that if you showed early results in the chosen sort of field, I mean, it's hard to even speak like this here. It's difficult to understand that a 6-year-old or 7-year-old will think professionally that I will be this profession. I mean, of course, there are kids like that, obviously, but very, very few. And with us, it was many. If you're going into music and you're lucky enough and you're fortunate enough to have enough musical development, I guess, whatever, some your ear is good and you can play a little bit and you can audition for a special music school. In my case, I was very fortunate. I was born in Moscow, so I was really, it was lucky, of course. So I had the direct line that I could go and audition for the Central Music School where my mother was educated. And of course, it was, I wanted to be just like my mom. And my mother was a phenomenal violinist and musician. And so there was really something to emulate and want to be like. And she went to that school. So, of course, where would I want to go? Only to that school. And when, it was very important to me to make it into there. And there was an exams, you had to pass exams. But once you're in, or if you're in, or if you just even want to go there, you're already thinking the whole life is in front of you. It's profession. You don't veer off anymore. It's very hard to get out of that line, which is kind of dangerous for a lot of kids, because we have to explore ourselves really. And if we want something else, maybe we should try it. But in my mind, that wasn't possible back then. Yeah. So anyway, so that was my very, very beginning. Um, yeah, there were some funny things connected to it, but I don't know if I want to waste our time here. The little stories about growing up in that kind of environment. But then my brother joined. Then he also started playing violin. Then there were four of us, and that's how it stayed pretty much. So at school, because it was a central music school, what it meant is that luckily for those who were in that system, we had everything in one school. First of all, from first grade and through, back then there were 11 grades. So high school was at the same building as the beginning school was, and then primary and middle and high school all in one building, of course, nothing, no separations. So you enter with certain people, they become your classmates, and you go with them all 11 years. Now I think it's 12. So you get great friends, hopefully, from first day or first months, and you grow up with them. Then you have all classes together up until a certain time. It would be all the regular academics, a little bit on the lighter side, because with that we will have solfege and eurythmics, or kind of eurythmics. It was, I don't know, applied eurythmics, maybe a bit different than what we know as eurythmics. Ear training, big time, and then later you will get theory and music literature, and all of that pretty early, at the age of 10, 11, 12. Then you get a language, of course, added to this. If you don't play piano, if piano is not your primary instrument, you will have the piano as a required instrument, so you learn how to play it. So that joins into the second or third grade. You start playing that also, which, in my opinion, piano should be the first instrument to play anyway for anybody. Honestly, I think that people should start with piano and then branch into other instruments if possible. But there are some other considerations when people start from other instruments as well, of course. So anyhow, and that's how it went. Then we had two classes, which again, there are, of course, definite pluses to that system. And that system is that, yes, you have the encompassing sort of education there. You know about music earlier than what happens here when I get students at UNT, University of North Texas, right? And sometimes they don't know elementary theory. They don't know what they're playing. They're just like moving things. And there's no understanding of what it is all about, which is inconceivable. To me, it's inconceivable. Well, conceivable by now, of course. By now, I start testing them, and before I get into like, okay, let's go to development. Development, things like that, forms. But anyhow, but there were definitely downsides also to any education system. I think there's no system in the world that is perfect. And downside for, at least in my time, they used to have two competitive classes, two competitive levels, I should say. So the fourth grade would be the first competition grade when all of us would play, and the programs would be more specific. So the teachers had to only choose pieces from the announced number of pieces and etudes and scales, whatever. And so all of us were pretty much as a competition, right? So people, the jury can compare, and those who didn't get a B. So if you got a C, you're out. So C plus or C something, you're out. And the judgment was harsher also. So we lost some of my classmates that year. And then the second one is in eighth grade. And that was really brutal because people played well already. People when we were all together for all these years, and we still lost some people, and they were just expelled from school, which I really don't think should be happening. It was very cruel. It was not necessary either, because all of those people who expelled, especially at the eighth grade level, what did they do? They switched to a parallel track school that was also in Moscow. It's a college. It would be called a college right now, pre-conservatory. So we had 3 years left to finish in my school, those who stayed, and they would go to this college, 4 years. So, and then they will all join us in the Moscow Conservatory just 1 year later. So, but meanwhile, they had to experience this horrendous heartbreak and horrendous feeling of, loss and, I don't know, just being thrown out after 8 years of being in one. I think it's awful practice. It shouldn't have been bad there.
Why was that system so rigorous? Why was there such an emphasis on this brutal sort of training? What was the goal, the purpose that the teachers were trying to achieve?
Well, yeah. The goal, I think, would be, you see, we hear a lot about the Russian school, and it does exist, I suppose, but there are also a lot of myths and misconceptions, really, and what the Russian school is. Russian school, in my opinion, of course, it's just my opinion. The Russian school, as I see it now, looking back at the distance, right? It was basically strength in numbers. It's basically when you get a lot of very talented, very capable, perhaps capable is a better word than talented, but very capable young people who play whatever instruments. And if somebody doesn't cut it, so what? Somebody else will be in their place because there are just many, many people to choose from. In a way, I think that system right now still is proliferating in China. Of course, in China there are many more people altogether, but yes, there are just scores and scores of phenomenally technically advanced players coming from China. But that's what with our situation, maybe not in such numbers, but still, it's basically you're um, you're disposable. You know, it's yes, they care about uniqueness, yes, they do, but if you cannot play because you got hurt, oh well, too bad, so sad. There will be
Mm.
another one who can play, even when the teacher is not. I probably should talk about this a little bit later in pedagogy, but for instance, a situation when somebody is playing and they like raising the shoulder, and one child or one person can raise that shoulder just as much as they want, it will never get hurt. But there will be minority of people. But majority, if they start raising that shoulder, there will be problems later on, right? Teachers would not notice. They would not pay any attention to that because it wasn't important. As long as your technique, which is how you move on the instrument, if it worked, great. If you hurt, you never talk about hurt. You never declare it to anybody. If you do, you would be immediately, dangerous, because maybe competitions, maybe that person will not do well in a competition later, so it all was not always completely locked into the competition culture, but a lot of that was because we all knew that in order to really get a good career later on, you would have to win some important competitions, and important competitions started, of course, with less important. Maybe we actually didn't have a lot of kiddie competitions, I must say. No, it didn't exist. We didn't have kiddie competitions, and we didn't have festivals, which was kind of bad because in summers you were just on your own for 3 months. But competitions still were there. There would be some important performances for which you had to be chosen. A little competition at school. So yeah, there was this spirit of competitiveness was always there, and not so much. Well, I don't know. I never felt it too much with my friends. But in general, you needed to succeed. You need to
Mm.
be better, 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 very reliable. And then, of course, with all of this and intonation or sound or whatever your teachers, of course, want from you, needed to be done as perfect as you can be. And that perfect, perfect, perfect was very heavily um, pressing on our heads.
Well, let me ask you. This is a conversation that I've had with some classmates before who weren't as musically gifted or talented or started late and were playing a lot of catch up. One of the things that I've been very impressed with from the Russian school is the caliber of player. I mean, my favorite cellist is Mstislav Rostropovich. For me, that is the standard of sound and technique. When I went and studied with Wendy Warner, one of his students. I mean, that was all I could think about was how do I sound more like this? What do I need to do in order to improve to hit this level? And in a conversation I had had with another guy, James Zimmerman, he was a clarinet player who was canceled from the Nashville Symphony. One of the clips I had posted that people did not like at all was when I had mentioned that Eastern Europeans, the reason why they're so heavily featured in orchestras is just because they're better. The training that they've come from is better. And I don't know if I understand that with an educational system like the one you're describing, there's a lot of, like you said, negative trade offs. But the other side to it, the positive side, is that the players are just generally better. And I'm curious, is that a worthwhile trade in your opinion, or how does one balance that sort of intense Russian rigor while also keeping the humane artistic experience alive?
Hmm. Well, I think it is important to not to mix the rigor and humane. It can be rigorous and humane. And but the first part of the question is how Russian school was supplying better, whether it was supplying better players. By and large, I think we first of all we have to go by instruments, okay? Because it really is important. Different instruments have a different start age, and also different teaching methods. And I would say that string playing, not necessarily all string playing, but maybe all, actually, yes. All string playing and piano playing, those were the ones developed the most in during the Russian school, I would dare to say. When I came to the United States, actually, I was absolutely amazed how for instance, brass sections sounded in orchestras. It was amazing. It was higher level, I thought, in general. In general, again, there will be fantastic soloists in Russia, of course, trumpet and trombone and you name it. I mean, there will be, and I'm sure that we had wonderful clarinetists, wonderful, but like in yeah, en masse, in a way, en masse in a very high level. I was more impressed with the orchestras in groups of the wind players here than somebody will crucify me maybe, but then it was in Russia. Now strings in general were, again, I wouldn't maybe go compare right now with orchestral sections, because you see in Russia there was also this. It was very culturally completely opposite. So with us, we went to conservatory, for instance, and we were all geared to be soloists. We were taught to be soloists, and we were taught to be soloists from the beginning, also at school. Which in at school it's probably okay, but in conservatory, when you already know go there, it's not a very good mindset, because in practicality, in practice rather, uh, all of those people cannot become soloists and play as soloists. Most of them will be playing in orchestras, and meanwhile the culture was absolutely skewed. So orchestral players were like, oh, downplayed. Well, if you didn't make it as a soloist, then you will become an orchestral player. So soloist and teacher, those were the the highest. And then there will be orchestral, and then teachers in schools, the lower level schools, not teachers at conservatory or university, but lower level schools. That would be the second best. Where chamber music fit? Interesting also question. Chamber music was very developed, of course. We had wonderful quartets. I was fortunate to study with the Borodin string quartet when I was in at school at the conservatory. My teacher of specialty, as we call it, specialty, specialist, which is what you play, the instrument, was the phenomenal Igor Bezrodny. I was very fortunate to get into his class. I always wanted to study with him, and I got to study with him. And then I was very fortunate to be, in with the Borodins as a quartet class, because we had quartet class separately, and then there was also chamber music at the conservatory, Moscow Conservatory. So anyway, but what I'm saying is that the string players were all then very rigorously taught to become the possible best technically as well. So then you get always pretty much following the Paris Conservatoire, by the way. The model of this of Paris Conservatory, it was, of course, because, well, anyway, I'll get to it in a moment. But yes, you follow this methodology was very, very developed. Violin, I would speak about violin right now, but the same goes with piano, I'm sure. Methodology was very developed. So basically, you would follow the certain process, and every teacher would follow the same, more or less the same process, more or less the same books, more or less the same compilations of even of etudes and scales and everything. And so yes, you get this mass effect of everybody being prepared for anything that comes along, which in here is not the case, because in here, meaning in the United States, I still find so many times that even maybe good teachers, but they skip stuff. They don't teach, for instance, basics on what I would consider to be absolute basics, which means written for violin by violinists. No, they skip a lot, and they just go from one piece which was not written by a violinist to another piece that was not written by a violinist. So you don't develop, like, the necessary tactile knowledge even of fingerboard, for instance. Scales are done. I think by now scales are done. But again, even they're just very haphazardly done by some from different sources. When I get people, they play scales, for instance, all slow and with vibrato. Well, okay, it's fine. Of course, for certain goal, it would be fine. If you're training vibrato on a scale, it will be fine. But playing scales in slow tempo with vibrato doesn't give you much of any technical control in fast tempo passages, of course, which is scales are for, you know, things like that. But again, I know I jump ahead probably to.
No, you're fine. I was just thinking, there are people who are going to be listening who are not musicians, who are going to have no idea what it is that we're talking about. But yeah, but it is important for anybody listening who is a musician, like how important fundamental technique is. And when we get into the pedagogy, I have some questions about balancing technique with artistry. But before we get to that,
Yeah.
what was it like coming from Soviet Union, Russia to America? First, actually, before we even do that, when did you come to America?
I came to America in 1987.
Oh, okay, wow.
So yes, it was the Soviet Union still stood, and I had no idea it would fall, and nobody, I think, knew it would fall in just 4 years. So when I was going here, I thought that maybe I would never see my relatives again. So it was really
Why did
very.
you come to America, if you don't mind me asking?
I got married. I got married to an American. He was a conductor, and we met in the one and only festival that I was sent to represent Moscow Conservatory in Hungary, and he was the only American there. That's how we met. Then we
Hmm.
corresponded for a year, and then he came there to marry me. So
Oh,
it
you
was.
married in Hungary.
No, 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 no. He had to come, of course, to Moscow. Oh no, it
Oh, I
was
see. Okay.
sorry. It was a year later, a year and a half later. Yeah, no, it had to
Okay.
be in Moscow. I couldn't go anywhere. At that point, you were not allowed to just go someplace if you because if you wanted to. It was still very closed. It was still, I don't know, iron curtain, but it certainly was a very heavy curtain by that time. And you could only exit into another country if you were sent there, by your either government or institution. In my case, it was Moscow Conservatory. Yeah,
And then
so
when you arrived in America, how was that? I mean, that's a huge cultural shift. How was that? Do you remember?
it's
Can you just describe what that was like?
everything was a cultural shift. First of all, I came from Moscow, the capital, and I lived there in my capital bubble, just like people who live in New York have no idea what the rest of America is probably. That's how we had no idea what was the rest of Russia. And then I come to United States and I came to a small town. Maybe I should keep it nameless at this point, or
Sure.
maybe not. I don't know. But it was a small town, some 200,000 people, kind of like where I am right now,
Hmm.
in Denton, Texas, right? But that was in Michigan. So I landed in Michigan. Michigan is my home state. And, there were all this, it's one story America, I think it's called, right? One story houses. And I was amazed because for me, it was like the dacha, that word dacha, which is the country house in Russia. And I think it actually exists in a vocabulary, in English vocabulary is dacha. So to me, it was a country home, but only very comfortable. So suddenly, I was supposed to be in a city, in a town, but I wasn't because I was in a village, in my opinion, But it wasn't village, and all thing it was so peaceful and so quiet, and all I wanted is like, where are the cows and the geese and the goats here on the streets? But of course, so that was number one. Number two, my then husband, he took me to grocery shopping. Of course, he thought that I would just die of the amount of food in the stores. I came right there from the place when we called it deficit. Deficit was lack of certain goods, and at any time there could be any goods that could be suddenly missing in Russia. Meat was missing a lot of times. Then suddenly toilet paper would be completely. Oh, toilet paper was such a luxury anyway. Whenever you had it, it was very rarely when you had it. So, and things like that we take for granted completely here. Suddenly, some other staples, food staples would disappear. No coffee, no coffee at all, or something, and you had to make do obviously with something else. And many things in Moscow, we were very well supplied. By the way, I shouldn't be complaining. What was happening outside of Moscow was absolutely disastrous.
Hmm.
Yeah, but here I come, and it's outside of New York. It's not near New York City or some big city, and I am taken to a supermarket, and I couldn't finish the first supermarket tour. But what really got to me? It wasn't the how much even. It's just the colors. I expired in the aisle of cereals because those colors blinded me. I mean, it was so much. It was such an overload of stimuli, basically visually. And I said, "Take me out of here." He thought it was. Oh my God! He was so impressed. There was so much food. No, it was a blast of colors, actually.
Hmm.
But yeah, so those things. Then I discovered there was Christmas here. And in my, we were country of atheists, were like raised atheists, right, by communist, socialist, um, morale. We were very much by the Bible. Only was called the Code of Communism. Okay, the rest of
Wow, I
stuff,
didn't know this.
yes, it's pretty much stayed like the same commandments, only a little bit skewed into the builder of communism has to have those qualities, moral qualities, and stuff like that. So anyway, and but I come here and suddenly Christmas that I thought was only in books in the past, Christmas is well and alive and people celebrate it. And I was like, I suddenly got 100 years or 200 years back in my mind. It was very strange. Of course, by now I don't have those. I don't hold those views anymore. But yes, that was probably the first three shocking things in microwave. Such a
All
thing as
right, so I
microwave.
have a quote I'd like to read you.
Mm.
It's from you, and I wanted to have you elaborate on this because you are a such a famous violin pedagogue and teacher. This is you were referring to. I know it's ridiculous to say this to you, but you were referring to Yasha Heifetz. So when I say Heifetz, it's Yasha Heifetz, the violinist. You said this was a question that was posed to you in regards to your teaching. You said, I'm doing Heifetz's job by trying to dissuade people to go into music professionally if I absolutely can.
Yes, I did say that, didn't I?
Yes.
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes and no, I think. First of all, I'm much more humane than Heifetz was towards his students. Okay, I really am, and I like it that way because I don't like the harsh methods of teaching. Um, but also, I do think that there is oversaturation of um, pretty much all musicians, perhaps right now. And I already felt that way when I was in conservatory in Moscow, eons ago. Even there, because it was a sort of like we were supposed to be, especially in that planned society, you would imagine that they would um, only produce the number of people who could then get jobs. And maybe it was a little bit better, but at least I was only in Moscow Conservatory, and there were other institutions of higher education, although also in there, who were also churning out all these professionals, right? And here in where I am right now, in America in general, there are so many of us, and especially young people right now, with the just economy the way it is, which I won't go into there because I don't really know how it is, but I just see the how many of my graduates remain in the field and how quite a few of them change the field later and they don't work as professional musicians. Meanwhile, they finished the bachelor degree. They paid a lot of money, even though it's not as much money as in some other schools. We're much better here at UNT, it's true. But still, you pay a lot of money for schooling and then you cannot find a job, or you find jobs that are not meaningful to you or they're not satisfying. You don't get into the orchestra, for instance, that you wanted to be in, or the level of orchestral exposure is not the same, or whatever it might be, or you're teaching students of wrong age. You know that you're good with students of 14 to 18, and all you have are the beginners of 3 to 5 or 7. So it's very hard to get jobs and continue as a professional musician these days, I think. So yes, when I see people who are kind of delusional, they and there are lots of basically delusional people. Again, it has to do with a system of not even education, but I think it's cultural system, that we support each child and we say, oh, you're the best, you're constantly, yeah, just do this a little bit, oh, it's wonderful, and a little these kitty competitions. There's no such thing as to say that you got less than, I don't know, excellent, I think. Is it excellent, outstanding, superior? I'm not sure, but it's sort of all superlative. So the child never gets the point that I'm not really that good. And maybe I am very good at this. Meanwhile, I'm going to gymnastics or to wrestling or to something else or swimming. And there, actually, I'm doing quite fine. But my my parents want me to play violin, and yeah, I'm constantly getting this. They don't get a feedback when to stop. you know for That's one thing. And the other thing also here, which is good, but professionalism is not so good, is when um, maybe capable, maybe talented even young people, children, they're doing way too much. Actually, they could do violin really well. They have the gifts for it, but they also have to take tennis and they have to take this, and then they have math and science club and debate or whatever else if they're older. And suddenly there's like that much time left to practice and they're not developing. And that part, of course, is completely missing in on the other side. So
Yeah, taking that in reverse order, I certainly had students who, and young students, I mean, 10 to 12, who were talented and had good families. So they had, a mother who would insist that they practice, but because they were also doing swim and tennis and horseback riding and debate and all these extracurricular things. There was just, they would come into the lesson and they hadn't practiced. Not even because I don't think that they had the attention span, just they had too much going on. But on the
Right.
other one, on your first point of delusional college students, certainly, and it wasn't just at UNT. For my master's as well, I encountered a lot of people who just should not have been doing music, and it wasn't that they were bad people or anything like that. It was just they didn't have the talent and skill to sit down and play at a professional level. I mean, not everybody should be a musician. But on that, I remember, and you correct me if you feel like I get any of this wrong or paint an unfair picture, but I do remember at UNT, uh, there were several students who were accepted, at least in the strings, who were not very good, who could not play. And I was surprised by that because, and I say this, I'm sure people can accuse me of bias, but I think it's also fair to say that the UNT faculty are all fantastic teachers, or at least for the most part, fantastic teachers. They have a very high standard of what they're looking for. And yet, there are students admitted into the program who probably should not have been playing. And I know some of them have not gone on to do anything, uh, which is why it was a surprise that they were accepted. So I'd be curious, is there anything there that you'd like to help me understand?
Yes, there are situations sometimes that if I could, or if we could, I would even speak on behalf of several faculty with whom we spoke about these things. Sometimes they're just numbers that are missing. Sometimes there are just places to be filled in our orchestras. And so I myself was in a similar, in a one several times, maybe in a situation when the dean of the school would almost directly appeal to me saying, "Oh, you have so many people on the wait list, and I don't have really room anymore in my studio. It's completely packed. It's full. But please, could we please make it happen that they come because we're missing violins. We need more violins for the concert orchestra, for symphony orchestra. Well, mainly those would go into, we hope, to the concert orchestra, which is a little bit more like training orchestra for the symphony. But although there's some really nice people playing in concert orchestra by now, of course. But yeah, so sometimes it will be just logistical things, has nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the level that we would like to have and teach, but just, yeah, to fill the places, fill the spots. And
Mm,
I don't think we should do this personally. I am opposed to it. I think that orchestra should actually sort of adjust to who we accept, adjust to the level or how many people, because we're not, these are not professional orchestras, these are training orchestras, they're school curriculum orchestras. But sometimes the conductor wants to like have all these 30 whatever violins more, I think, and therefore we need to supply them. Curiously, of course, those who can't play, well, some of them, sometimes they learned, if they got into my hands, sometimes, but I'm not saying that altogether they would learn. It sometimes it is impossible to teach somebody who just cannot really cannot get it, what needs to be done, or has a delusion, yes, a delusion of grandeur, if you will, that they're already okay, and of why is she requiring me to do this or whatever. Usually I don't have this, I don't see this attitude, but it may be deep down there, and that's why this person is not developing. um, but the main thing, I think, it's a little bit away from the subject why we accepted those people, but let's say somebody who's on a lower level, because we always have a span, of course. We have somebody who's coming undergraduate um, first year freshman, who would be playing might be playing better than some doctoral students, and actually not bad doctoral students either. Still would be a stronger player. Is it possible? Possible. And usually, I must say, those people are always from other countries speaking, about the system of education. There would be, yes, the French conservatory style teaching and rigorous training from early age. You can't get away from that. So, but yeah, we can have somebody on the first year freshman who is playing better than doctoral students. And meanwhile, we'll have some freshmen who started violin at the age of 11 or 12 in public school in Texas or some other state, and had very haphazard education, well, specifically technical education, um, and don't know how to listen to themselves and cannot hear themselves at all because their ear is not very developed. And yes, these people can be acceptable sometimes because sometimes they just grow. Sometimes they start listening. The main thing is to actually learn how to listen to yourself and hear you rather than hear the ideal in your head. And those who are capable of making this leap at some point, when they start hearing how, pardon me, awful they really sound, that's when the real progress begins with those. And if they're capable of it, yeah, they can improve a lot.
Hmm.
And I had such cases, yeah.
Yeah, I always considered it very, because I did not play well when I first went to UNT at all, and I always thought it was very merciful of Professor Ruzovich to let me in, and he was very patient with me when he probably shouldn't have been. But that mercy has helped me and carried me much farther than I think he even realized.
I agree. I mean, at first, you cannot be harsh. If you press on the student and you just don't even know the potential there. Because yeah, when I was a young teacher, then I would immediately, oh my goodness. So when I landed, a little bit backward, right? When I landed in the United States, my first teaching job came by itself. I did not seek it. In fact, I kind of didn't seek any teaching job here. I was very lazy about this, and it just sort of both came to me. I taught only in two places. I taught at Interlochen Arts Academy, sorry, Arts Academy first, then Arts Camp at Interlochen Center for the Arts in Michigan. And I was nearby when they had some kind of a situation where the violin teacher had to be removed or retire quickly, some kind of health problem. So they had to have somebody immediately step in. And I was in a position to be relatively close. So I could travel by car, and they heard me in performance. By then, I already performed once at Interlochen as a guest artist. So I already started being with the agency that I was back then as a player, as a soloist. So they heard me in performance, they invited me, I had some brief masterclass, and suddenly I was on the faculty of Interlochen Arts Academy. And my very first lesson, um, the poor girl was crying on I think it was maybe minute number 7 of that lesson. And I couldn't understand why, because I heard her for the whole of 2 minutes. I saw what the problems were right away, and I thought I know exactly how to fix them. And so I said, okay, okay, sit down, sit down. My accent was much worse too. And you know how Russian accents are. We're kind of harsh accents, right? Yeah, so here I was, even with much harsher accent, I'm sure. And here I was like, sit down, and she sits down. And I start telling her, okay, so we need to fix this, and then we need to fix this, and we need to fix this and this. And suddenly she's crying, and I'm totally lost. I don't know why she's crying. I get, of course, like, oh my goodness, what's wrong? You know? Yes.
Yeah,
I lost those ways in a hurry. I realized first that you need to listen to the person much longer than 2 minutes, even if you know, if you think you know. By the way, later I discovered that actually, no, you cannot say everything from 2 minutes like we thought in Russia. Because in Russia, we had those steps, we were taught, ta, 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 and you hear this missing, this missing. It's really missing. But here, people develop in completely different ways. So you have to hear more of them because you suddenly can surprise you. Oh my goodness, but this they can do. They cannot do that. But it's very simple, but they can do much more intricate things because they learned it in a different way. Well, that's a very big resource, actually. And plus, just psychologically, in Russia, in those methods, nobody cared about your psychology at all. Here, maybe we care. I don't think we care too much, honestly. No, I think a pedagogue, a really great pedagogue, wonderful pedagogue, has to get master of psychology. And that's what, for instance, Dorothy DeLay was. Everybody knows that she was remarkable as feeling people and getting being positive with them, as well as very demanding, by the way. So they're pedagogues, I think, always, well, not always, but best pedagogues here combine those qualities. In the other countries in Europe, it was still the hard way. It's my way or highway, right away, and it's mostly based on harshness. Yeah.
Hmm.
But I was lucky. For instance, with Bezrodny, with whom I studied, he was not that old Russian, even though he was Russian and he was from old school, but he was a nice, kind person, very musical, very, very supportive. And I always wanted to study only with him because I knew he was different. And I had enough of this harshness. My mother was a wonderful pedagogue also, in addition to being a phenomenal violinist as well. But she was more like, yeah, my way or highway. Until she started teaching outside of the country, like in France. Then she learned the other approach also, which also I think only enhanced her teaching as well and understanding of people. So, but anyhow, so it's a little bit again tangent. But the point is that yes, it's important to combine the two definitely, and not to cut people short right away. No, thinking that you know everything that they can show in 2 minutes.
Well, I did want to ask you about this balance between technique and artistry. One of the, and you again correct me if you feel like I get any of this wrong. One of my issues with a lot of the, especially modern competitions, not necessarily in the past, but the competitions of today, is the style of playing strikes me as very technical. So it's impressive from almost a scientific analysis, but
Mhm.
musically is lacking. And there are I don't want to say names, but there are violin studios I'm familiar with that actually train their students to be, yes, technically proficient, but also to be very, for lack of a better term, flamboyant on the stage. Very exaggerating, lots of faces. I've mocked this before as making the sex faces on stage, and I know Arsenti has talked a lot about flirting with the audience. This sort of look at me, look at how great I am sort of mentality that is, I think, prevalent in a lot of the competitions that are happening right now. On the flip end of that, though, there is such a thing as just a very passionate performance. Again, I know I mentioned Rostropovich earlier, but if you watch a lot of Rostropovich's performances, he's not being flashy or flamboyant on stage. He's just captivated by the music, and the music. He's acting as a conduit, and that is obviously possessing, and that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. But when it comes to, again, these modern competitions, the body is now, it seems to me, replacing the music. It's my face. Listen with your eyes rather than your ears. And I'm curious, as a teacher, how do you balance the technical requirements in a student's
Mhm.
and also allowing room for musicality?
Well, yes, it's a good thing. First of all, the visual is not necessarily musicality anyway. So the visuals, they can be extension of your musicality. I don't particularly love the word musicality either, because it's sort of it's a very general description. Um, but yes, like you mentioned Rostropovich, or there were some other performers of the past also. They were expressive, I would say, in some ways in their faces when they played, but it was completely genuine, as you mentioned as well. It was, I don't know, you can't really, and you shouldn't be explaining what's the difference. You clearly see when somebody is making faces because they think it will be effective. And some could make faces because they don't know that they're making a face. It just really naturally happens. And it's the same thing as we are so attuned to faces. So it is the tiniest of details that are not staged. So when I think it's very important to realize that, yeah, how should I say it? They're crazy people, like in a good way, in a musically crazy people, maybe. Well, crazy is a too forceful a word, but so involved in music that it will naturally show on their face. Great, we will see it. But there are many and most right now that are actually either taught, you're right, some teachers actually teach it, which I think it's horrible. absolutely, I would say even abhorrent to do this. But on the other hand, that's what audience wants, because by now audience is completely sold on those exaggerated facial expressions and exaggerated bodily movements. I mean, in violin, especially with piano, you cannot do quite as much, I think. But of course, we have long. I mean, he started our era of all
Yes.
kinds of things, showing that it actually was possible to do this kind of clowning thing at the piano. But on violin, because you're more mobile, you can actually do more. You can bend down, you can go up, you can turn, you can raise all shoulders if you can, meanwhile still accommodating your technicalities, and of course a face. And then when you see the videos, for instance, they a lot of times they just focus on faces of people instead of show me the figure, show me just like I shouldn't be really even looking at you. I should be listening to you. But meanwhile, we're looking and the face is there and they will be this and this. And people react, for instance, on YouTube sometimes more earlier in before I was um, completely accustomed to it. I saw that people would comment. I would imagine they're probably not professional musicians. I hope they're not, but still quite disturbing. A quartet that just won some competition. I also won't name names. Playing very boringly. I mean, a well-known piece of music they're playing. I just have it on YouTube and I'm not watching them. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is very mediocre. I mean, professional, clean, but nothing. And I'm looking for maybe an example to give to some of my students to listen with this particular piece to, several examples so they can compare. And this is not cutting it at all because there's just nothing there. Then some strange stop suddenly musically, whatever. So, I mean, and then I look at them and I see, like, oh my God, and this violinist and that one, and this position, and this eyes there. And then I read the comments, and the comments like, oh my goodness, it's so wonderful to see such musical performers, to see such musical because they're not musical. I mean, their playing is very bland. And so that's a very good way to check yourself actually. If you're not looking at them, are you touched? Are you moved? Or you have to look at them and then you're riveted. Well, if you are that way, it means that you're attracted to visuals. But it's also, on the other hand, completely so. We are visual beings. Most of our information comes from visual inputs, unless, of course, those people who lack the sight, let's say. But majority sightless people, of course, most information is through the through the eyes, not through the ears. So you have to develop ears to override the eyes or avert the eyes on purpose, which is really hard to do because we are naturally, me too. I mean, I'm on the whole, listen to somebody. Of course, I will be watching the performer because that's where sound comes from. But luckily for me, I was always nearsighted all my life, and therefore I follow sort of the a wonderful expression of my one of my very favorite poets, Marina Tsvetaeva, and she said, "It's deadly to look at the world with full sight." With non-myopic eyes specifically. It's deadly to look at the world with non-myopic eyes because you see too much. Anyway, so this is definitely helps us to not fixate on people's faces and their positions, but the general audience, of course, is absolutely sold by that because it's a pantomime. It's theater. But it's not music then.
What do you do when one of your students starts to develop this, or maybe comes into the studio with this sort of
But
narcissistic "look at me" attitude? How do you deal with that?
you know, I almost never had those.
Hmm.
Yeah, they don't come. I mean, I had several people who moved too much, just not because they want to impress with their movements, but because they're maybe before they were taught this way, or maybe it's actually natural to them. But it's still it. You first need to have a frame. You have people to play and move physiologically nicely, and not to distract from the point of projection. What if you're playing for a microphone? Recording, you should be able to stay in one place and perform because if you're constantly moving, the microphone was not going to be happy. you will suddenly be losing just the volume, for instance, on some notes, just because you turned away too much, or quality, perhaps. So basically, but very rarely, most of the time, actually, they're compensatory movements too. There are movements that, again, to general, like a layman audience, if I could say, would look like they are expressive, but professionally, we know that there's a compensation. For instance, people sway from foot to foot a lot of times in the violin world, and they do it because they're tense somewhere. So that's how they alleviate the tension, but it has nothing to do with music. And sometimes it can hurt your actually music if you do it the same way, with the movement of the bow. So in such situations, I will actually tell them to move otherwise, actually, to develop this rather than going with that. And that will be not for the look. It would be more of coordination of the body coordination, the hand coordination, the muscles of the back being involved correctly, not to
Hmm.
get tension in your neck, and stuff like that. But not for the looks. I do have people sometimes that I have to a little bit let them, be looser, but I would never really instruct somebody to have a face, you know, put your eyes
Yeah,
up.
and to the credit of UNT, especially when I was there, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't remember that ever being a problem. I think some of this is just coming from some of the schools that I've not only attended but visited. I saw this more prevalent in other places, but again, now that I'm thinking about it more carefully, that wasn't a problem at UNT, and I think that goes to the credit of the not only you but the teachers for selecting students carefully.
Well, but also, there's another thing. Let's honestly look at situations. When somebody is technically very, very proficient or brilliant, they can layer it up with all kinds of mimicry and all kinds of extra movements, and the technique still stays. So if you go to, I would imagine you go to Juilliard or Curtis, Juilliard, those upper level, absolute New England Conservatory, upper level, really A-list schools, as they're called sometimes. Then you will have more of those people playing really well, and then they can afford to clown around because they don't miss notes. And people in other places, they are still have to concentrate on not missing those notes. And therefore they cannot layer it up. And this is sometimes the situation if somebody comes to me and they're not yet phenomenal players at all, and meanwhile they're trying to do it. I said, what are you doing? You can't even play that thing in tune. And meanwhile you're trying to express it. No, it's not going to work that way. You need to, because everything moves. If you're moving too much, you're losing the control over your movements on the fingerboard. For us, it's fingerboard for the violinist, right? For string players, rather. It's very tiny muscles that should not be wiggling at all. And meanwhile, here's a big bodily movements and everything wiggles. So this is also probably why you would see more of the clowning people, so to speak, the visuals in other places. I mean, in maybe more well-known schools, put it this way, more of them. But interesting thing was about visuals. I heard it and I read it, and I can't remember where I read it, but there was a very interesting um, experiment done. It was I can be completely off here right now because I don't really remember fully the article, but it was something about a piano competition in which the places were awarded. It was not as small, but not, I think, as extra big competition. I can't remember the details. Let's put it just very plainly. So, piano competition, uh, first through whatever, fourth or sixth place were awarded. And then the panel of other professional musicians, not those who were involved in the competition, of course, were asked to do two things. They asked to watch the performance of all the medal placements without sound, only watch on the monitor, and based on what they saw, to rank the performers from first place to the whatever last place was. And then they were asked to listen to the same exactly things that were they were watching without sound, and then they were just only hearing the sound and not watching the faces or the performers. And of course, they were the same people, the same passages, the same spots, but in different, possibly in a different order. I don't remember that. Anyway, the rating was completely different. And the rating that won was a rating based on completely monitor, visuals only. It was the closest. Did you hear? Have you heard this story?
It sounds familiar. It might have been actually Arsenti who I heard it from, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But yes, yeah,
No.
that's something I found frustrating. I don't like competitions for this reason. I don't like the way I play in competitions versus the way I play outside of competitions. I feel it's very different, and the things I'm focusing on is very different. And not that I've ever won some huge competition, small competitions like scholarships and things like that. Those sorts of things. And I'm not a fan of what people do to win the competitions. It seems like a compromising of the art. And let me ask you. I know how Arsenti obviously feels about competitions. How do you encourage your students to do competitions? I guess it's an easy way to jumpstart a career, but is that something that you focus on at all?
I don't focus per se on competitions because I find them less and less relevant for career development at this point. Um, First of all, what it used to be when there were very few and very big competitions, it's not anymore. And I think many people and teachers and students alike, they still think that the word competition means that you will be immediately advancing somewhere. It's very far from the truth. There are lots of layers of those competitions. Nowadays, there are many competitions that I call them, in my mind, I call them fake. It's the ones that you apply with a very big application fee usually, or if not for the first round, and then so the second round, if you're chosen for the second round, suddenly it's free. First round is free. Then you get to the second round and suddenly there's a hefty fee, like $100 or $150 just to get into second round. So I would consider them fake competitions because what I mean, usually the results don't matter at all for your future career, and the prizes are terrible. And for a lot of teachers, it's kind of a boost. Oh, my student won this Golden River competition, or whatever they might be called. There are several of them in New York. They involve Carnegie Hall. The people at Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Hall. Yeah, you will play there for 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes in the same evening with 35 more people as your final, award achievement. And there will be nice pictures taken, so you can put them on your social media. So this is able to do nothing for your career whatsoever. But then even non-fake competitions, but like real ones, when you actually travel in person, eventually if you make it through, and you do get a prize. I mean, there's so many of them right now. They're so diluted that even the big ones become diluted that way because the attention is like, of course, we know still there are some very big ones. They like Queen Elizabeth is standing. Now, Tchaikovsky competition by now is kind of closed basically for all the Westerners, really, for political reasons. We will leave them alone. But Van Cliburn stands. Queen Elizabeth stands. Vinyavsky competition, I guess, still stands. There's several new ones that became big ones. Fine, but even they don't launch anybody's careers now. There's so much more that needs to be done, and things are changing. And honestly, I don't see that competitions are that crucial as it used to be at their inception. And there were very few of them. Again, selective. Then it made sense. Now it's all over the place, so it doesn't serve that role. But the other thing that you mentioned, and we kind of, I think you asked me earlier as well, um, why in competitions, why people like competitions? Well, I think that's in human nature. We're competitive creatures. We constantly compete. Who is and but what you can compare? You can compare something tangible. Somebody who ran faster and got there 1 millisecond even faster than the other, now that we can tell with the equipment, or lifted more weight. I mean, the quantity, you cannot compare the impression that this person made on you. This performance moved me, but did not move the person next to me because he had indigestion the whole day and didn't really listen. But he heard that, oh, one note was out of tune. And you heard that that note was out of tune, but it didn't matter because there was something else in there. So what you can judge? You can judge the hard things, which is technique. Then who plays the for us in performers with intonation, like strings, not piano. Piano is pre-tuned, and we're creating the tuning as we play. So for us, yes, to hit the note, to play in tune is very important. So then you calculate everything. Then you are very careful. By the way, all the people who became clowns later on, they never did this in competitions. Never.
Hmm.
They were all much more controlled because they needed to produce the technical as flawless a result as possible, and because that's what you can judge. Now, if you have two absolutely, well, or as flawless as possible performers in a competition, then you probably could go, depending on the jury, you would go either by what pieces they played, what kind of, heavy, hefty musically pieces, or a little bit lighter. The heftier will win. That's just pure musical merit of the piece. Or it could be that, yes, one of these performers still technically the same or very the same level, but one was a bit more profound or between or a bit more romantic or something, whatever it might be, of non-technical matter. It's very rare. Mostly it's just flawlessness of technique. The equipment, as we call this kind of equipment, our hands, what they moves
Hmm.
the best. Yeah. And also nervous systems are very different, by the way, very different. The more expressive performers, they're usually the higher sensitivity people. Who wins competitions most of the times are people with very good nervous systems. So you're not reacting to where you are, to audience. You know how to get yourself into this and just deliver. But if you're if you really perceive it, oh, and you're very excited, stage fright is a big thing. Not And people confuse it, thinking, oh, if it's somebody experiences stage fright, it means that they are not good enough musicians. Not at all. Not at all. It cannot be farther from the truth. There are great many examples of people who were mortally frightened of stage, and very big names too. They managed to deal with this. They medicated themselves one way or another, and they went and delivered. So, but these days, it's, when you're dealing with kids, those were all already musicians of age when they could medicate themselves in some ways, but again, say yes or no to it, I wouldn't ever want to say no, because we would not have Henrik Schering if he didn't medicate himself, or, well, many others anyway. Or
And you're
people.
talking about things like beta blockers that
No,
help.
back then there were no beta blockers even. It's just good old drink,
Hmm.
for many. But again, not everybody can play with alcohol in their system, because only few people can then control all the movements. That just the edge is taken off. Which was the case with Henrik Schering, obviously, because he was famously known for always playing a little bit after consuming some alcohol. But it was medication. It
Hmm.
was self-medication for the nerves. It wasn't because he was an alcoholic who just loved to drink and go drunk on stage. He never appeared drunk, So, but there was, Jacques Thibault, phenomenal competition. Sorry, there was Jacques Thibault, phenomenal violinist, French violinist, and then there was a competition in his name. I think still exists, maybe Jacques Thibault and Marguerite Long,
Hmm.
for piano. And Jacques Thibault suffered terrible nerves every time. He played so much. He was so famous and wonderful musician and violinist. Or in Russia, there was Leonid Kogan, phenomenal uh, professional, phenomenal virtuoso, great musician, who was very tense and just, he had stage fright issues. But it would never sound in his performances, it just took toll on him. like it was with other people, I'm sure. So, and then of course now there are beta blockers. And by the way, I am perfectly fine with if people have that kind of nervous system and they cannot train themselves. There are ways to kind of do it without, of course, but that requires a lot of training, especially if you were born with a nervous system that is just too easily influenced by this kind of stimuli when you're in front of huge crowds of people and you have to perform on very high level and you're judged, heavily judged, you know. So yes, there are ways, of course, to develop it without any kind of medications, but very few people actually can. Most people just stop playing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What is your career advice to musicians then to develop themselves when they leave college? I know that there's an orchestra route, there's teaching, although orchestras are very difficult to get into in the United States. Like if you want a salaried job, first off, the odds of a position even opening are so rare. And then in strings, I mean, it's like good luck if you've not been preparing for 5+ years learning all of the excerpts and you have them memorized. And even then, if you have that ready, I mean, it's still kind of a crapshoot if you get in. I've heard some stories. Regional orchestras are obviously very easy to get into, but at the high level, if you want something like that, but beyond, gosh,
Yeah.
what are the orchestras and teaching? What do you advise your students to do?
Well, first of all, I think that the teaching for the orchestras, first, my opinion is that, again, in order to contemplate a good orchestral job, one has to have a very high level of technique. Because in the orchestra, it's not your musicianship. Nobody can see your faces at all, of course, because it's all beyond the screen, behind the screen. And you do not want to move around. You want to be extremely steady and just hit everything. Because an orchestra, it really has to be as flawless, as close to flawless as possible. So sometimes, literally one note slightly out of tune can throw you out of the round. You don't pass to another round. And I think there are maybe minority of cases when people truly prepared all audition excerpts and they played them for 10, 15 years and they really got to play them better, 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 and finally they stay in their hands. There are some cases of that. And I actually have a couple students of mine. I mean, my students, I must say, many of them are in really good orchestras, but only maybe a couple have gone that way. They really didn't have the spectacular technique by that time to play anything, and they just trained and trained and trained and trained excerpts and made it to, I would still say, not the first caliber orchestras, but still caliber orchestras, really high caliber orchestras. But those of mine, for instance, that play in New York Phil, I have people in LA Phil, in Cleveland Orchestra, um, you know, Swedish Radio Orchestra, I think it's called. I mean, many, and then of course in other orchestras like Minnesota, Dallas, and so on. Um, but those all, they had already the level of technique, and then they decided that now I will be auditioning for the orchestra, and then that level will hold them under pressure. You see, you cannot do that. It's not about excerpt learning. It's not about training on the excerpts. It's about everything that can hold you in a moment of stress, horrendous stress. And then, yes, and then you also have whoever listens to you, who are the judges, also very important. That particular orchestra, there were several situations when I think San Francisco at some point, and sometimes Boston. I mean, they have the same competition. I mean, they don't take anybody. They just have this one spot available, or used to be anyway, not maybe recently, but and it will be just every year. People prepare, people spend money to go there, pay their way, pay the hotel and everything, and then go away. And wonderful people, by the way. But something is not sitting well with this particular number of juries, musicians who listen to them, and they don't take anybody. And sometimes they do, and it's kind of like, really? That person actually stopped. in the middle of excerpt somewhere, an excerpt, also things like that are known to happen. And nobody knows why that person suddenly was advanced to the next round when somebody who played really flawlessly wasn't. But it is behind the screen, so it kind of eliminates the who pulls whom situation, just, chance, luck. And then, of course, they're like, your good day or your bad day works a lot in your favor or against you. You can be fabulously prepared, but you have a bad day. Something is off. Some sound distracted you, or just, things just don't go, you know. And then meanwhile, somebody else who has like the best performing day of their life would never be as good a player as you are, for instance, actually earned, but that was their, pinnacle of their achievement. And right on that day, right on that spot, they will get a job. So yes, it's as you said, crapshoot is right. It's
So,
very
how do you advise your students to blossom professionally if they don't do orchestra or teaching?
well. They do, of course, they
Hmm.
do. Most of them, I would channel them to think about this because this is like real money and real career. Actually, here in the United States, is really fantastic to get into a good orchestra, or in a great orchestra, even more fantastic. But even a very good orchestra you get, and then students start asking you to give them lessons because you're in the orchestra. See, that was a big thing with Russia. Very, when you were asking me about the cultural shock and whatever differences, right? So the big difference there, if you were orchestral player, and you could be a phenomenal player, but you would be in the orchestra, and therefore you were not looked upon with such reverence as the professor of the conservatory, who didn't play anywhere, for instance, already. I mean, at some point, obviously played, probably most as a soloist. But let's say their career is done, or they decided it to be done, and they're just only teaching. Those people would be revered way above any orchestral player. And if you're a soloist and you're teaching, oh, even more so. You see? And here, when I came, and I was at UNT already when the UNT got me, um, from Interlock. And as I said, I was lucky. I never had to apply, really. They called me and said, would you be interested in being our finalist? One of our, well, maybe I shouldn't be saying this. Maybe it's classified information. I don't know. But that's how it was in reality. But okay. So at UNT, being at UNT, and I was still playing as a soloist, lesser with the time, but nevertheless. And so people would ask me, "So, oh, you're a violinist. Who are you playing with? I mean, which orchestra you're in?" I said, "Well, I'm a professor at UNT." Oh, I was like, "What's up with these people?" Then I realized, oh, I see. You're not good enough if you are in the eyes of the large audiences. You're only good if you're playing in the orchestra because the orchestral culture is trumps the soloists and trumps the teachers and all of that. Yeah. So, but meanwhile, it's true that only being in full-time professional orchestra, that's what will allow you to live nicely and not to hassle and not to go gig to gig and not to do much of freelancing. You could, of course, if you like to, teach or even play on the side, but at least you have your salary. And so, yes, of course, that's a good thing. But then I have to judge among my students whom I actually can offer this route. And a lot of times, what I need to deal with, I do deal with, is that those who are actually can get into the orchestra, maybe if they really train, then specifically already training excerpts, of course, the time comes, then technique is there, everything is there. Now train the material, right? But they don't want to because they think that they will make it as a soloist. And I know they won't make it as a soloist just because they're simply too old. And what is too old in our world? Now, in our world, unfortunately, too old is already like you're 20 and you have not yet, done some kind of a huge competition and won something. That becomes kind of already too old. It's horrible to say, you know. So speaking of competitions, again, you asked me earlier, do I gear my students for competitions? Not really me. On the other hand, if I see somebody, usually people want to do competitions themselves because the competition culture is around. And so they would, oh, well, can I do this one? Can I do that one? And if I think that there is a possibility for them to even just go into the live round, I would say, sure, let's look at the program and let's make that your program. And you succeed, fantastic. And I had a student, for instance, who was really all about competitions, and he was very advanced technically. He was Chinese. He was very well taught before came to me. He lacked some things, even technically, because of course, you develop and develop and develop, but mostly it was about stage persona, stage presence, and musical expression that was missing. But he wanted to do competitions all the time, so I had to pull him back, trying to just let's concentrate on one rather than on immediately three, because it's just not doable.
Mm.
But he did, he, for instance, went to Menno competition, because he was of age that he could get through, and he went through to live round. He didn't advance to second round, but it was still already much better than what before. He couldn't even get to the live round when he previously trained where he was. So that was nice. He was happy. Then he actually went through several competitions, went to live rounds, and in one of them, in Paganini competition, went to the second round, and then was not lucky. Actually, I must say, really, truly, it wasn't because he was my student or not. He just plainly wasn't lucky. That was one of those things with the circumstances, not him, but circumstances. So never got into third round. But he probably was the highest, by now, the highest ever competition player in the history of University of North Texas. That's for sure in
Mm.
violin. So but besides him, I didn't have anybody go that far for that competition. But there were people who, of course, won positions in orchestras. Those are big competitions, just on a different material. So, and yet again, I sometimes have people who are fabulous and playing so well, in orchestral excerpts are in great shape, and they're dependable. Play 12 competitions into the orchestras, don't get the job until finally. No, finally, usually those kind of people, they will get the job eventually. They just have to have a lot of nerves under control to not give up. And those are, of course, I will support, because I know that they can do it and they should do it, and the orchestra will benefit from them being there. So of
Mm.
course I will support and encourage them. But those who are delusional, who think, oh, I will just prepare and go, well, to those I said, well, okay, let's try. I would still prepare them the same. I will not slack. But whether they will be able to actually progress and gain, that's another question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last question, rather, I always ask guests, what is something practical that you'd like audiences to take away from this conversation, or if you have any practical advice for people going out of this episode?
Well, for the audience, I would have a practical advice of developing the ear rather than the eye. And I think the deliberate listening is a very important technique for audiences to acquire as well. And again, the first way you can develop it is to close your eyes and listen to the music. And if the music starts speaking to you, then it's real. And if it doesn't speak to you and you don't see the um, impressions on your neighbors, even who are still watching the performer, um, you will start developing, I think, the inner ear, not the inner ear, just the real ear for music, and not the eye for music. That would be for the audiences, because I think then the scope will tremendously expand, because there are many very good musicians who still don't do faces and don't do the exaggerated bodily movements, and actually playing really well, and more than well. And one of them, of course, I'm very fortunate to be married to, Arsenty Kharitonov. He's definitely one of proponents of, or exponents, or whatever you can call it, examples of that sort of playing. Or, like you mentioned, Rostropovich in old ways, Heifetz, who never moved and still can move you when you just listen to him. So that would be for the audiences. Um, and for performers, for students especially, learn to hear yourself first. Learn to listen to yourself and learn to hear yourself, and not what I used to call in the old days the tape recorder. Back then there were still tapes. Now nobody knows what the tapes are, of course. But then CD players. Then I switched to CD players. Now it will be MP3 or whatever players in your head. What I mean is, when we grow up as musicians, we absolutely have to have that safe place when we don't hear our own screeching, which at first always accompanies our beginnings. We sound horrible when we start. That's what our parents know. That's what people around us know. When you first start playing violin or cello, whatever, it's horrible sounds. By the way, in Russian, the name violin, do you know what it is like? The word is skripka. Skripka. What skripka is the best to translate into is, I would say, screechka. It's from screechy noise that the door that is lacking oil makes. That's exactly that. So, in Russian and several other languages, the word for this wonderfully sounding violino, violin, is actually taken from the first attempt to play it. Yeah, and not the ultimate result. So during those first years of our playing, we all sound horrible, and we will not develop if we just really hear it. What we do, we imagine that we sound like this recording because our teacher said, like, or this person. Listen, listen, and then you start identifying, oh, this beautiful sound is what that's what I'm making. And then you grow up like that, and that gap, of course, is horrendous at first, obviously, but you don't hear it. You constantly project that you sound like this, and you should. Because if you hear yourself, you will give up. So, and with age, that gap starts diminishing. But what happens in the upper levels, that for many people, there's still that gap. Maybe not as big, but it will be like something like this. This is where you want to be. That's where you really are. And unless you close that gap, you start hearing where you really are, not this. You're not sounding like that. You're sounding here. That's what's the most important. That's when you start growing really to the what you really want to sound like. And that usually happens somewhere in conservatory or at university level. Yeah, so that's the most important thing I want to people who are really professional, want to go into profession, to learn to do that, to listen and hear yourself.
Julie Bushkova, Professor Julie Bushkova, it has been a tremendous privilege. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me here, David. It's a pleasure.